What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Discovering Bob Dylan podcast here on Taste Like Music. It is me, the only person on earth whose Bob Dylan vinyl collection consists solely of Infidels and Empire Burlesque. And I can guarantee that that is a fact. There's no one else in the world that only has those two albums in their collection, nothing else. So props to me. I am prepared for this episode. I'm prepared for the 1980s. And yes, today is the day we finally come to Bob Dylan's 23rd studio album, Empire Burlesque, released just 8 days before my birth in 1985. It's a fun fact. And yeah, Dylan, you've dreaded this day for a long time because you're going to have to fully and wholeheartedly badmouth a Bob Dylan album. How are you feeling about that?
I've been looking forward to talking about this stretch of albums for quite some time now. But coming off the Infidels episode and a review from you that I wasn't entirely expecting, I'm more excited and curious than ever. So I pose that we get right into it. I've generally tried to keep my cards close to my chest about my feelings on whatever albums are coming up in our schedule. But longtime viewers and listeners of the show might remember me tipping my hand in the very first episode, letting my feelings on Empire Burlesque slip. But before we get to that, let's why don't we talk a little bit about how and maybe more importantly why Empire Burlesque came to be.
I don't really know why it came to be honest. I guess, Bob Dylan, mid 80s, he's searching for something. Like you brought up in the last video, the images of him with all those huge pop stars in the We Are the World recording, studio. And he looks like he has no idea what's going on. He doesn't know where he is. He doesn't know the trends. He doesn't know anything. And the other anecdote about, what does Bob Dylan sound like? Bob Dylan asked. So he's searching for a sound. He spent a while, at least in Bob Dylan terms, in Dylan years, making and sort of thinking about this album. And, interestingly, he got an eclectic mix, a bunch of different artists to come in for this. Seemed like he went through a lot of sort of aborted sessions, trying to figure out like what was going to work. And it seemed like he had an idea to make a contemporary 80s sounding, MTV sounding pop album. Infidels had an 80s sound. It sounded like it came straight out of the Mattel factory in China. Very plastic is what I'm saying. But Empire Burlesque really, I think, leans into just the whole 80s-ness of it. I think Infidels was sort of like accidentally plastic because it was the dawn of the digital age, and that was just what Mark Knopfler wanted to do. But this one feels like it was purposely done to take advantage of the trends of the 1980s. So maybe you can add to it Dylan's mindset, whatever little details about, what he was thinking or not thinking when he decided to make Empire Burlesque.
Well, I think what's interesting about it is it seems like there was certainly a concerted effort during Infidels to create a record that was going to be well received and give it kind of a nice tight sound overall to it. Kind of like we talked about in the last episode. He committed to a producer, he committed to a studio and a backing group of musicians, and I think whether or not you enjoy the product or not, he succeeded in that. And now I agree with you. There's even a more concerted effort to go for this very particular thing. And what I think is interesting is, when you consider everything going on in this time period, he's still, despite trying to make this very contemporary 80s record, he's still trying to stay kind of in the world that he's always been. He's grabbing members of the E Street Band and the Heartbreakers. Springsteen and Petty are kind of in that that second movement of, quote unquote, the next Dylans, singer songwriters who are very clearly inspired by him, who eventually, work with him to some degree or another. And so he's getting them, and he's not getting any of the real 80s sessions players. And he doesn't get Hugh Padgham to produce this. He doesn't get Phil Collins to produce this. He produces it himself because who who could possibly understand the sound of the 80s better than Bob Dylan? So it's I think it all just sort of speaks to him not fully being there. He's going for something, but he's not reaching in the right places, and there's multiple anecdotes about him being very deferential during the recording of this record, which historically has not really been Dylan. He's been one to go against the grain. He's been the one to question people, to challenge people. And here he's just sort of taken some swings, and eventually he's just sort of like, yeah, sure, okay. If this is what everyone else wants, then we'll go with it. And that doesn't seem very Dylan-esque.
No, and it's interesting. I mean, reading through like all the people he could have or almost worked with, like he had one session with Al Green's band, a session with Ronnie Wood, a session where he was with Lone Justice, the fun cowpunk band came out around that time. Eventually, he settled on like the least interesting possible sound for his album, which is Bob Dylan producing the 1980s. And I think in a vacuum, I don't find this type of production offensive. I'm a big 80s fan. I like 80s production on a lot of things. But like you're saying, jokingly, Bob Dylan is not the guy you want to produce an 80s album. And I don't know, maybe we can just get right into my review, my
Let's
opinion.
go.
I think it comes off just sounding like sort of like Infidels. This one sounds like he stumbled into the 1980s, the sounds, the synths, the plastic sounding guitar and the reverby drums and the impotent bass sounds, and just sort of vomited on his songs without really thinking about how they're going to fit together. There's some horns on this album, there's some female backing vocalists, and there's touches of things that he had done before throughout the 70s, but it just sounds bad because it has the wrong production on it. And spoiler alert, these songs aren't good. So, with Infidels, underneath it all, there was a good album. Like the songs were very solid. Joker Man's a great song. There's some great songs on that album. He wrote Blind Willie McTell during that time. That's a great song. Here, I don't hear any good songs. So not only do you have the lousy production, you have, kind of crummy sounding, poorly written songs. And it's funny, I listened to this album and I got just nothing out of it. So I went back and I read some of the lyrics. In reading the lyrics to a song like Tight Connection to My Heart, it sounds nothing like it should. Reading those lyrics, I can't believe like those were the musical choices he went with. Because the lyrics, without, divorced from the music, they're still kind of profound and emotional. And I think at the very crux of it, it could have been a good song. But paired with that music, it just loses it totally falls apart. The disconnect between the emotionality and the profundity of the lyrics and how it sounds, which is like, I don't know, like B grade Survivor. Like it's just a lousy sounding album, and the songs are screaming for a more nuanced production. I think his singing just doesn't really work most of the time. It's forced. A song like I Remember You, I think has a nice melody. Like I think it is arranged properly, but the production and the construction of like the song and the sounds around it really lets it down. Dylan's really straining when he goes for the big moment. He just doesn't have that voice to pull in like the drama that 80s pop music requires. Like he's not Peter Cetera, he's not Phil Collins. He doesn't have that like kind of 60s soul that he can put a lot of vibrato on things and sort of sex them up. There's some songs, Trust Yourself sounds like The Pretenders, a little bit like Learning to Crawl, kind of middle of the road type music. Emotionally Yours, you sent me a version of it, which I thought was pretty solid. It has some balls to it. The one on this album, it is really bad. The way he sings emotionally, it just totally sucks. It's probably my least favorite vocal performance of his whole career. There's like these,
Emotionally, yo.
yeah, and he doesn't do that on the version you sent. Like on that version, he sings that with, he sings it in a way that sort of makes it sound real. Here it sounds like, David Foster wrote it or something and sort of is like hackney, ham-fisted song. Um, and I don't think it's impossible to do this type of music in this period. I think Tom Petty and Steve Winwood, Bruce Hornsby, I think they did this kind of music well, kind of over dramatic, rock and roll. It still has that 80s sheen to it, the shine, but they were able to just sort of fit it all together in a way that worked. And Bob Dylan, produced by Bob Dylan, doesn't quite get there. When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky, like that song could be on the Rocky Four soundtrack. It is a fifth pumper. Like that is like Survivor, baby. It is like the apex of the 1980s. I was almost aghast when I heard that. I couldn't believe like he went there. So yeah, this is a patently ridiculous album. Um, I do think Dark Eyes at least, it's stripped down, takes away everything. It's just Bob, light acoustic guitar, harmonica. It's a decent song. I still don't think it sounds great, but I think it's good. I think it's a good ending. Kind of fits with some of his other sparser closers. In general, I went and listened to some other albums from 1985, No Jacket Required, Hounds of Love. And I think the difference is just those artists, Phil Collins, Kate Bush, some of the bigger 85 artists, I think they leaned into the ridiculousness of the 80s in a way that works. Like I think Bob's just sort of like half-assing sort of his leap into the 80s. He wants to be Bob Dylan, but he also wants to be sort of, with the times. And it just doesn't come off well at all. It's a big miss. I mean, everybody's entitled to them, but yeah, this one just lacks the ambition to really go for it, I think. And it just feels kind of like caught halfway. Yeah, there's nothing really here to like. There can be no revisionism on this one. You can revise the Christian trilogy and whatever else. This one just, has lousy songs, it's lousy producing. The playing is with all the great people on this album, the playing is so anonymous sounding. Like you got Sly and Robbie again, you got Benmont Tench, you got Al Cooper filling in, you got Jim Keltner, Bob Glob, Mike Campbell, Ronnie Wood. Like it is a lot of big name people, and there's not a single moment of this album where it's like, oh wow, that's cool. That's a cool instrumental part. Like, oh yeah, there's Benmont. There's Benmont doing his thing. There's Ronnie rocking it. It just does not work. I went back and looked at my list from 1985, my album rankings. It's not as bad as Sonic Youth. Nothing can be. But it's worse than, Dog Eat Dog from Joni Mitchell, and it's probably on the level of like Ice on Fire by Elton John, which is a low 2.5 stars, which for me is pretty bad. I don't go below 2.5 unless it's like just something unlistenable. And I didn't hate listening to this album. I just thought it was just, wildly misguided, we'll say, attempt by Bob to fit in the 80s. And yeah, it just doesn't work. It's an album we can just never think about again, really, as far as I'm concerned.
Wow. I'm trying to remember the last time, if there has been a time where I fully agreed with everything that you've said. And you've said there's no revisionism for this, and this album does have its defenders, and we'll talk about that in a second. But yeah, I think when you bring up the other big pop acts of the day, your Kate Bushes, your Phil Collins, regardless of what you think about those artists, whether you like them or dislike them, or what you think about those albums, those artists had so much confidence in what they were doing. And I think that's ultimately going to lead to, you know, a better product, quote unquote. Everything is subjective, but if you look at the way that something is put together and produced and presented to the world, I don't think there's any questioning that those artists succeeded much more in their efforts than Bob here with this album. And yeah, there's not a lot of confidence. I don't think there's reason to have a lot of confidence. And you said it perfectly. How can you have so many incredible musicians on an album and not be able to pick any of them out, or to be able to listen to anything they're playing and be impressed by it? For those of you, I guess, who haven't watched from the beginning, anyone who's tuned in recently, I can't imagine that my opinions on this record are too big a surprise. I've been very vocal about my distaste for heavy 80s production. And although the sound of this record is not the only thing wrong with it, it is certainly one of the biggest factors that plays into my similarly low opinion of it. There are very few artists that I'm willing to put up with utilizing stale synthesizers and superfluous background vocals, comically sheen guitar tones, canned horns, reverb that threatens to drown out every sound in its path. And despite Bob Dylan being my favorite singular artist of all time, he is not one of them. I think Empire Burlesque sounds like absolute trash. And I recognize that when I use a term like stale synthesizers, that is through the lens of someone talking about this album almost 40 years later. There's certainly a discussion to be had about the validity of calling something dated, because oftentimes people throw around that word in hindsight. And is it fair to call something dated if the sounds or technology that they're talking about are simply what was available at that time? But even with my subjective opinions on production elements from this time period, I can recognize what the best sounds are from this time period. And I don't think Empire Burlesque holds a candle to any of the records that most people would consider the best of this decade. And for me personally, that gets in the way of enjoying songs that I might enjoy otherwise. I know that some people are capable of just looking at the skeleton of the song itself and enjoying or judging it only on those merits. I respect that. We all hear and enjoy things differently. But at least on this record, it's hard for me not to take it into account. If we do look at those skeletons, I agree the songs aren't uniformly lousy. There are some clunkers, including Clean Cut Kid, which thematically is something he was capable of tackling really well in the past. But I think the heavy handedness of it kind of mirrors just how scattershot he was with everything at this point. And he wrote that one during the Infidel sessions too, and he couldn't revise it to make a more interesting set of lyrics here, which is even more disappointing. But there's some decent stuff at its core. We talked about Someone's Got a Hold of My Heart in the last episode, which became Tight Connection to My Heart here. I much prefer the original version to it, but like you said, there are elements of it that make it a decent song. Did you watch the music video for Tight Connection to My Heart?
Yeah, that was pretty spectacular. I feel like I knew that that had happened, but I had never watched it before, so that was a treat.
Cannot recommend it enough to anyone out there who may not be familiar with it. It is a cinematic masterpiece. But yeah, there are a couple of outtakes on the Springtime in New York bootleg series of, like you said, Emotionally Yours and Seeing the Real You at Last, which I think are significantly better than the final products, showcase the lyrics a bit better. He recorded I'll Remember You in 2003 for the Masked and Anonymous film, and that blows the album version out of the water. There's a live cut of Never Gonna Be the Same Again from 1997 that I really enjoy, which is amazing because the version here might be my second to least favorite song on the album. I think it sounds dreadful. My least favorite song, probably unsurprisingly, is When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky. Just a horrendous concoction of sounds that goes on for 7.5 minutes. I have such a hard time believing that this is a sound that Bob was truly searching for in any like honest way, or a sound that he was in love with. And again, like the other tracks I just mentioned, at its core, not a terrible composition. There's some great lyrics in there, actually. Yeah, I saw thousands who could have overcome the darkness. For the love of a lousy buck, I've watched them die. Stick around, baby. We're not through. Don't look for me. I'll see you when the night comes falling from the sky. It's decent, and there's a version with the E Street Band on the first bootleg series release that's definitely more palatable, but it is the opposite of what I want music to sound like as far as the finished product goes. There are defenders of this record, and I understand it to a degree, especially if you like the production or you don't mind or don't consider it. Because from a songwriting perspective, it's not the worst, but I also don't think many of these songs, even if you strip them down, could be considered anywhere near his best. Or even, we've disagreed on production before. I'm not as hot on the way that Street Legal sounds, but a song like Changing of the Guards, even if it's not my favorite sounding song in the world, it's a masterpiece lyrically. It's one of the greatest things he ever wrote. I think there's nothing here. The huge exception is Dark Eyes, which I think is an amazing breath of fresh air, and it is such a slog to get to it. It's been a hot minute since we've just heard Bob with harmonica and acoustic guitar, completely unadorned otherwise. I think it's a beautiful melody. I think it's a great set of lyrics. And even if you're trying to have that argument of, oh, well, do I only like it more because it's the one acoustic song, the one organic song? It's like, I think if you look at it lyrically compared with everything else, I still think it rises to the top. I think it melodically rises to the top. And then, yeah, certainly, even if it doesn't sound the absolute best, to me, it's a huge breath of fresh air. I actually quite love that song. And it's unfortunate that's the only thing that sounds anything like it, because it's a really hard record to listen to, which you might not guess from such a great, inviting album. I mean, talk about something that's aged really well. Come on. Look at that guy. Look at those colors, the design.
Yeah,
Wow.
that font choice, like it is just like I am in the 80s now. This is the 80s, 1980s. Everything about it screams 1980s. And I mean, that's really just I think the big issue. He didn't, I mean, did he care? Was he even coherent at this point in the 1980s?
Well, we've talked about the state he was in while he was making We Are the World. There will be people in the comments defending the album. There will be people picking apart the individual songs. There will be people saying they don't mind the production or they don't take it into account. That's fine. It would be boring if we had to stop every sentence on the show and say, this is just my opinion. This is subjective. But it is to a degree. But I don't know. I don't see how anyone can look at his catalog. I mean, like you said, we're 23 albums in. This has got to be your least favorite so far. You look at any of the records of original material, largely original material leading up to this. I don't even know if this compares to even the weakest of them. I mean, if you throw out Pat Garrett, since it's a lot of instrumentals and the covers albums, even if you weren't a huge John Wesley Harding fan, but even you could recognize these songs are well written. It's just it doesn't sound the way I want it to, or whatever it is. Um, I don't see how anyone could look at this set of 10 songs and say there's a lot of good stuff here. You might be able to say, oh, well, I really like Tight Connection to My Heart, or When the Night Comes Falling from the Sky lyrically, or Emotionally Yours and I'll Remember You. The OJs do a really good cover of it. There's stuff here, but as a whole collection, Dark Eyes for me, far and away, this my second favorite. I don't know, maybe Trust Yourself. It got an okay groove, I guess. It's not so loud and in your face with the production. I don't know. It's not the second best written song on the record. It's maybe my second favorite to listen to, but um, yeah, I don't know. It's a really, really difficult one for me. But the great news for the purposes of our show is that it gets worse. It really does.
And
Because, sorry.
now, it's blowing my mind that it could get worse for you. Like I could see it getting worse for me, but I can't even imagine, and I have zero experience with Knocked Out Loaded, his next album. So I do not know anything how it sounds at all. So that will be a treat. And the fact that you think it's worse than this, man, I'm excited.
So you have heard Brownsville Girl, because I believe that somebody in our Patreon, which, if you click the link below, you can become a Patreon subscriber and have access to so many wonderful things in the world of Taste Like Music, including becoming a member of the Discord where you can talk to us all day, every day. Um, so you have heard Brownsville Girl,
Okay.
um,
Yes, I have.
which has an Empire Burlesque originally written during these sessions as New Danville Girl, which was released on the aforementioned Springtime in New York bootleg series. And people had known about it for years. It had been bootlegged many, many times. Like I said, people will talk about Empire Burlesque. They'll come to its defense. And there is an understandable element to that. These are still 10 songs written by Bob Dylan, universally accepted as one of, if not the greatest songwriter of all time. So, there's merit to be had there. So we are about to get into two albums, which we've decided to lump together in the next episode. We are going to knock out Knocked Out Loaded and get down in the groove in one episode, because for people like us, we might, and I definitely consider Empire Burlesque to be a part of the nadir, but the true, honest to God nadir is the next two albums. And so we're gonna knock it all out at once. And they, unlike Empire Burlesque, they are not all songs written by Bob Dylan. You're asking how invested in this was he? How focused was he? I don't know. That's questionable. But when you look at the next couple albums and you see that he's not even writing some of the songs anymore, and exactly what he's doing to those songs and what he's doing to his own songs, it does get worse. And I've got a lot of opinions. The only thing I can tell you to keep in mind is that I think the absolute most defense that you'll ever see for either of these albums, Knocked Out, Loaded, or Down in the Groove, the most you'll see is someone saying, "Oh, it's not that bad," which is the opposite from an album like Self Portrait or the albums in the Christian trilogy, where there are sections of fans who say, "No, this is among my favorite Dylan. This is some of my favorite stuff he's ever done." And even if you don't agree with that, or if I don't agree with it, there's kind of an argument. The absolute most for these next two is, "Oh, it's not the worst thing ever," which I feel like it's the equivalent to, basically all the Beach Boys albums after 1977. The most praise that I've ever heard for Keeping the Summer Alive, or I don't know, Still Cruising, or whatever it is, well, it's not the worst album I've ever heard. So that's what I'll tell you to keep in mind. Maybe it won't be the worst thing you've ever heard.
Well, that will be exciting for me. I mean, we've been through a lot of, at least the critics and at the time, oh, this is the end of Bob Dylan. This is the worst Bob Dylan yet. We heard it all the time, like you said, Self-Portrait, even the 1973 Revenge album, label Revenge album. I read all about, this is terrible. This is the end of Bob Dylan during the Christian trilogy. I don't agree with any of those things. I thought at worst, those albums are 3 stars and listenable. Empire Burlesque showed me that there's another side. There's that darkness,
Good one.
where Bob Dylan just, he lost his touch. And when you write this many albums, it's bound to happen. It happens to pretty much everyone. So I'm not going to hold it against him that he has a couple stinkers here in the 80s. Happened to, Neil Young, happened to everybody. Let's give him a break here. But I'm saying this before I've listened to Knocked Out, Loaded, and Down in the Groove. So we'll see how I feel after being subjected to those two. And we will discuss in depth next time here on Discovering Bob Dylan podcast. So let's hear from the Empire Burlesque defenders. I want to hear in the comments why you think this is even a decent album, or if you think it's a good album, a great album, whatever. Why do you think Dylan succeeds? Have you ever listened to another album before from 1985? Leave your thoughts in the comments. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, check out the description for all the links to Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Patreon. We'll even put the link to the hilarious Bob Dylan music video down there. You can check that out. You better start listening to what the hell are these albums called?
Knocked Out, Loaded.
You better listen to Knocked Out, Loaded, and the other one, Down in the Groove, for next time, because we will be discussing both in one very special episode. So yeah, we'll see you in 1987, 88. I don't even know. Does anyone
6.
know?
You've really nailed this outro.
I was doing good until I got to these two shining gems in his catalog. Join us next time for Knocked Out, Loaded, and Down in the Groove. We will discuss both in depth. We will not hold back. Yeah, we'll see you then. It's much easier to be negative about stuff than positive. Really.
Yeah.
At least for me.